right. Thank you, Senator Paul. That was fantastic. We're going to roll right into our next conversation here. This is on Toward a Realist American Grand Strategy. That line might look somewhat familiar for all of you because as you came in this morning, you picked up a printout of the article of the same name. You'll have a little bit of a primer on what our discussion here is going to be about. That was written by Representative Warren Davidson, who's joining us here today, along with Representative Anna Paulina Luna in the American Conservative. So I'll introduce our two speakers here, and then I'll hand it over to my colleague. First off, Representative Warren Davidson, as I mentioned, represents Ohio's 8th Congressional District. Before he was elected to Congress in 2016, Representative Davidson served in the U.S. Army and was stationed in Germany with the 3rd Infantry Division when the Berlin Wall came down. He then went to West Point and graduated near the top of his class as a student of American history and mechanical engineering. As an officer, he led the Old Guard, the 75th Ranger Regiment, and the 101st Airborne Division. And joining Representative Davidson will be my colleague, our own Sumantra Maitra. He's a senior editor with the American Conservative. Before that, he came to us from the Center for the National Interest. I'll hand it over to Sumantra now.
Thank you, Emil. I hope everyone can hear me. My voice booms anyway. It's interesting to talk about war and peace and realism in a town covered with smog and low visibility, but enough about Mordor. Congressman Davidson, thank you for being here. I'd head straight to the basic questions that you wrote about in this article that everyone can find in the registration table outside. So you have been interested about American interests in Europe. I just want to start with the basic question. What are the American interests in Europe, and are they the same as how they used to be doing NATO when NATO was first formed?
Yeah, so, NATO was formed really to lock in America's power at the end of World War II. If you look at America's interest, go all the way back to World War I, it was controversial to create a draft at the time to participate in World War I. What was America's interest in World War I? Good question. Obviously, a lot of American ancestry goes back to Europe, so people felt an affinity. But because of that, it was touchy to say which side could we get on board with, because a lot of Americans had Germanic ancestry and not just French or English ancestry. And then so World War II, we were reluctant to get involved, right? So it took the attack on Pearl Harbor to get America to the point where, all right, we should actually do more than just sell weapons. And so we got into the war. The last time the planet had as much debt as we have right now, following on to Senator Paul's comments, was at the end of World War II. We had the Treaty of Bretton Woods. We literally reset the entire global monetary system. And the good thing is we knew that we actually had to pay down the debt. Right now we have that much debt, and the fight isn't even about paying it down. It's not even about servicing the interest. There's not really a coherent plan. And how did we lose this? Well, I think really in the process of that transition of fighting and really winning World War II, and certainly winning the shape of what would occur at the end of World War II, we kind of succumbed to the temptation. So you mentioned the reference to Mordor, of course, Lord of the Rings. This power, changes people. And I think the one ring to rule them all is money, right? It is the coercive nature of money. And, we created, became the world's reserve currency at the end of that. And so that basically created the framework for empire. And, I think one of the best book titles recently in the realpolitik space was, and I say recently, it was in the late 90s, Pat Buchanan's book, A Republic, Not an Empire. So that's not an endorsement for everything that he writes about in the book or for him, but I just think the title really sums up what happened. Is at the end of World War II, America started working to build an empire instead of preserving our republic. And while there was a consensus at the end of that led to us paying down the debt, by 1971, we were now shifted into empire management. and we've gone up in terms of our debt. And if you look, one of the most important sites is WTF happened in 1971.com. The WTF happened in 1971.com. On August 15th of 1971, the United States broke the gold standard that was implemented at Bretton Woods. And we kind of preserved the world's reserve currency by creating the, quote, petrodollar. All commodities are still going to be settled there. And so we're still in this scramble to preserve empire. So the real question is, can you get behind an empire preservation strategy? Well, then in that sense, yeah, we've had an interest in Europe. Because if Europe shifts to a hegemony dominated by China and Russia, and the payment system globally shifts, and we won't really be able to use the money as a way to coerce and control the system in the world. And if we keep them in our orbit, we can kind of preserve ours. And I think the real path is to just restore our republic and get a government small enough to fit back into our Constitution. Could we do that and still maintain the NATO guarantees? Maybe, but as you start looking out, NATO itself is a defensive alliance, right? And I think a lot of people have been sold, a lot of Europeans have been sold the idea that joining NATO is really just buying war insurance and America will fight your wars for you. And what we're seeing in Ukraine is if America won't actually fight the war for you, they'll at least fund the war for you. And so we're cutting a lot of checks to fight a proxy war. And the common denominator is we're not actually defining what our interest is. We're not declaring defining a mission. And when you don't define a mission, then you can't hold anyone accountable for success or failure, but you can keep funding endless wars. And I think Eisenhower was a person that really saw the risk of what was about to unfold, that we would potentially be pulled into this period of creating an empire and abandoning the republic. And, he never got accused of being an isolationist because, he's General Eisenhower. But he spent way less on the military. He focused on it. He cautioned against the military-industrial complex. And he also cautioned against the scientific technical elite, which, Anthony Fauci is the epitome of that. So the two big wings that he saw as a threat to the republic, I think you'd be hard-pressed to say have not turned out to be a pretty big threat to the republic.
Congressman, I'm glad you mentioned about the scientific technological elite about Eisenhower, because one of the key questions is the NATO bureaucracy, and that's on autopilot. Michael Anton this morning was talking about the nature of bureaucracy, and that kind of goes on its own. Is there any way to reform the NATO bureaucracy? Because essentially, we are the largest contributor, and they are the ones who are getting money, and they're commenting on domestic affairs of different countries and constituents, and they're talking about disinformation, like the rule of expertise. So a policy question would be how to reform that. What would be your opinion on how to reform the current structure?
Yeah, good question. We actually voted on this earlier in the year, and I was one of I think about a dozen people that voted no. And why? Because the bill was crafted and messaged as a resolution of support for NATO. No, that's not what it was. If you read the bill, it was support for a new strategic purpose for NATO. We don't need a new strategic purpose. They don't even do what they do now, right? And it follows on, if you look at the timeline of what, just the short version is a long, centuries-old version of how there came to be war between Ukraine and Russia. There's a lot of history there. But if you just go back, America ended the Afghan war on August 31st of 2021. And on September 1st of 2021, America entered into a strategic partnership agreement with Ukraine to support their membership in the European Union and NATO. On February 22nd of 2022, Jens Stoltenberg, the leader for NATO, Secretary General for NATO, gave a speech where he talked about the ability of NATO to project power around the world. That's the new strategic purpose that they want to talk about, is the ability for NATO to turn into some kind of power projection platform. It's a defensive alliance. Where would they need to project power? You know, that's a complete opposite. And 2 days later, that's when Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. Now, that doesn't excuse his invasion or anything else, but there are reasons why the Russians are particularly concerned about the expansion of NATO. What has grown is NATO, not the redefinition of NATO. To get to your question, how do we do what they are already trying to do? They are in fact already trying to do what you said, redefine NATO, and they're also using NATO as a tool of the European Union because they put in these strategic centers to focus on disinformation, right? Well, they want to essentially engage in influence operations to coerce governments to comply with the European Union. And what are they talking about? Well, they're talking about countries like Poland and Hungary who want to have more conservative social policies, pro-family policies. And so the administration, the current one, rewards countries like that with openly homosexual ambassadors who are there flying pride and trans flags, and that's the number one foreign policy objective for Hungary, apparently, from the administration.
Right.
Not like, building our actual relationship with Hungary, but actually just like the European Union, driving a wedge between, the values of that country and our own. And so that is a tool for projecting, not really America's principles, but certainly the current administration's principles. And NATO is being co-opted to be a participant in this process. So how do we do that? Well, we have to get leadership that it says we're not going to fund anything other than a narrow interest in NATO. And as a condition of us funding anything related to NATO, you have to comply with the treaty. You have to fund your own defense, and you have to be willing to participate in your own defense. And we should be very clear in our commitments that if we are to remain part of NATO, we're only going to help you win a war. We're not going to fight your war for you, period.
So the thing that you mentioned about the Eastern Europeans, Hungary and Poland, and their interests are differed from the rest of the core Europe in the West. One of the things that you mentioned is not many countries in NATO are paying their 2% share of defense that they're supposed to do. Now, there is an argument that because of the expansion of NATO, because of the frontiers of the Western countries moving to the east, these countries do not face any kind of threat that they're supposed to face. And because Americans, and to some extent the Brits, are positioned in the Eastern Europe, they don't feel the threat enough to pay for their own defense. So the question is two-part. One, is NATO expansion and European expansion a flaw, and is America suffering from the success of the 90s in a way? And if so, is there a way to divide the countries to make sure that they pay for their own shares?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the biggest problems, and I mean, it's a big part of why I decided to not stay in the military, is we didn't really know what we were going to do after we succeeded in the Cold War, right? We had all this power, and we didn't know what to do with it. Well, China knew what to do with it. I mean, they certainly made a lot of use of the end of the Cold War and have clearly advanced China's interests. And America has not only not advanced our interests, we're actively helping China and others advance theirs. That doesn't mean that we should be on a war footing with China, but we should actually be reoriented on our policy. So, the groups that most like a long war in Ukraine are Russia. As long as there's a war going on, Ukraine's not going to be part of NATO. I mean, Lindsey Graham would like them to be, this week, but they're not going to be part of NATO as long as there's active war there, because the other NATO countries would feel like, whoa, that'll pull us into the war too. So even if America got to that point, I think a lot of the other countries would be like, whoa, we don't really want to go to war with Russia. And then China is pretty content for there to be a long war in Russia too, because they certainly appreciated that for this century, we've largely been focused in the war on terror. And, we were using all the resources to go to Central Command to fight, jihad folks in the Middle East using the most advanced weaponry in the world to take out pickup trucks with machine guns on the back of them, right? And China is like, great, we're going to build the biggest navy in the world. We're going to, work on ways to defeat your aircraft carriers. We're going to use space to be able to take out AWACS and everything else. And meanwhile, America's military still can't get the F-35 supplied with reliable components. China's worked to infiltrate those supply chains. So China is certainly appreciative of that. And, there are people within China who are hardliners. I think Xi Jinping is one of those. He's a radical departure from Hu Jintao, which is why you saw Hu Jintao perp walked out of the last People's Congress in China. Very radical departure. Xi Jinping is essentially a Maoist authoritarian. Not necessarily a Marxist per se. Communism with Chinese principles, which capital grows things and creates wealth, but he's got a very different view on that than what was underway prior to his tenure. So I think we should be reorienting that way. And I think one of the mistakes that if we completely abandon NATO without taking that context into consideration, China would be very happy to come into Europe and say, we'll be happy to keep you safe. From who, I don't know. But they've done it. We used to have the Monroe Doctrine. Right? We used to take a particular interest in the Western Hemisphere, all over South America, all over Central America, even with Canada. China's built very deep ties, right? And that is undermining what has historically been part of the realpolitik security approach to the United States. I think the opportunity is to work in NATO to do really a broader view that isn't just militaristic, but is more holistic. And when you think about trade, one of the mistakes of the 90s, Bill Clinton spent all of the 90s working to create the World Trade Organization and structure it in a way that has highly favored China. They get treated as a developing nation, a developing economy, but they pledged as part of that to be a market economy. And of course, they're not a market economy, they're a command economy. They weaponize they literally use their entire intelligence service to target intellectual property. They steal intellectual property, they shape market access, they buy up companies in the United States and everywhere else. They don't just do these things to the United States, they do that to everyone. And essentially, it's exactly how they took over Hong Kong without firing a shot. It's how they are so far insulated. They could do military attack against Taiwan, but they're working to do it without a military attack prior to Xi Jinping. And I do think Xi Jinping wants to do something military just to be seen as the alpha and not just be viewed as powerful, but be viewed as the most powerful and on his own terms, on China's terms. So I think that's real. The question is that something we should take the bait on? And I don't think so. I think we should work with a different end in mind. But I think put that context in, and if we could, every military academy in the world, I assume the ones in China as well, will tell you you're more likely to win a war if you multiply your allies than if you multiply your enemies. And part of the problem with the approach we did on trade wasn't that it wasn't in our rational self-interest, it was we went to war with everyone all at once, right? And reality is we should have been dealing with everyone to confront China's trade practices, because China's really breaking the spirit and in fact the terms of the World Trade Organization, the rules-based order that Blinken alludes to. And to the extent there is a vestige of, principled American history, the business of America's business, right? We've been a trading country since we were colonies. And so how do you get back focused on free trade? Well, you have to make it actually free. There is no such thing as free trade with China. So if we don't deal with that, we aren't going to have this kind of more civil liberties oriented culture that I think a lot of people hope for. And that's ultimately why the anarchists always fail. Someone else uses power against them because they find them ill-prepared to defend themselves. That's right. So we have to get back to where we are truly secure as a country, and that's what we have. We have a republic if we can keep it.
So the next question, obviously, is how do we? So a lot of people know about the theory, but they don't really understand the processes that goes on. And one of the major problem with that is the last, in Trump administration, his views were not pushed through because there were various elements within the institutions, whether it's media or NATSEC bureaucracy. Is there a way to reform those lobby groups or media or Pentagon? What would you say? Because from your former experience as an army man.
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the best phrases out of the Trump era was "drain the swamp," right? I think everyone realizes there's some sort of embedded bureaucracy that finds themselves, eventually viewing themselves as the true protectors of the country, and the politicians are just going to be politicians. We're the real heroes. We're going to protect the country. No one epitomizes that more than Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, right? Or Dirtbag, as I refer to him. All right. So this guy felt like the president, he literally said in a hearing that the president has a role in foreign policy. But it's really, lieutenant colonels like him who are the real heroes, there to protect us, right? To spy on the president's phone call and to try to use the fact that he was, going to actually ask a rational question. Are you guys going to look into the corruption over here as a grounds to impeach him? So, this is the kind of, we truly have built a police state. The good news is, so far, it hasn't truly been, while it has been weaponized, it's not really like what we think of as a true authoritarian controlled police state. But a lot of the cautions that people, shared with the passage of the Patriot Act and the response to 9/11 were, this is going to be abused. Don't be foolish and trade, liberty for security, particularly in a way that's unaccountable. Since 2005, we have not had an appropriations bill that passed. Well, in 2005, that's when Homeland Security was created as a department. That's when the Director of National Intelligence was put in place. That's when kind of the culmination of some of the things that came out of the Patriot Act happened, and the reorganization happened in the intelligence community. So how could they get away with some of the things that, are at least cited in the Durham report, or kind of public knowledge, things abuses that they've engaged in? And I think those are the tip of the iceberg, things that Edward Snowden has shared, lots of things that have become public knowledge since those days, and frankly, even more that are classified, right? There are a lot of abuses. And how do they do that? Well, because they've not been held accountable. And the key to doing that is the appropriations process. So that's where the win of the kind of the stealth win of the last debt limit bill, and I won't say the overall debt limit was a win. It was has all the shortcomings Senator Paul was highlighting. But to the extent there is a win, one of them is it is designed to push towards real appropriations. If you don't get all 12 appropriations bills done, then there's a 1% cut locked into a continuing resolution. So it's essentially the penny plan, not a full, robust version, but it does put downward pressure on it. And for the defense industry, the defense budget, it would actually go down by 4% because they were promised a 3% increase. And normally that's how Republicans have been rolled on spending, is the defense hawks cut a deal with the progressives and say, all right, well, as long as we get $1 for defense, you can have $1 for these programs. That sort of deal with the devil got broken in this last debt ceiling fight. So we are highly motivating it by breaking the link between non-defense and defense. We are highly motivating it by the 99% CR. And then we have to get the real appropriations across the finish line. And if we don't put the terms and conditions in, shame on us. I mean, Elon Musk basically bought a crime scene with Twitter. And, what are we going to do about it? I mean, the good thing is, Speaker McCarthy and with input from all of our colleagues, agree we should create a committee on weaponization of the government. This is really, we have a committee focusing on this. And so that should really give people some hope that we are going to start to drain the swamp in this respect. We have to take the things we learned from that and get them implemented in law through the appropriations process. And the best success that I could think that we would get is consequences if you don't do it. And they're not the most grievous consequences, but it's a real step in the right direction to say there will be some.
I wanted to ask one more question before I throw it to the audience. You mentioned that you were in CNN this morning, talking about the debt ceiling bill anyway. One of the things that happened, or they're trying to do at least, is to keep acquisitions for Ukraine separate from the bill that passed. So if that happens, is there any way to stop further Ukraine aid from happening, because it's already crossed 115 billion? My count.
Yeah. So yeah, and if you put a tax on every single American, I think that works out to be like $350 a person. So if you really want to help Ukraine, you're already in for $350. Can we count on you for another $350? Everyone. And since the kids can't have the money, you're going to pitch in for the kids too, right? All right. So it'll be a little bigger. So I think if you look at it in those terms, how much does America really support the thing? And we might, but we've never defined a mission. So you go back, historically, post-Vietnam, we supposedly learned our lesson, and you don't get into a war unless you define a mission. And then, the ideal is you also have a plan for an exit strategy. How do you get out of this war? And those questions haven't been answered. So, I think there are like 10 of us that never voted for any not a dime for Ukraine. And that's my basic criteria. Like, well, you've never defined a mission. You've never defined what success looks like. And help Ukraine. Well, you try saying that as the mission at the infantry officer basic course. You will fail, right? You have to actually have a real mission. And the range over there is anything from make sure the war doesn't spread to NATO countries, to no Russians in Ukraine, to no Russians in Ukraine, including the Crimea boundaries, to regime change. Victoria Nuland would say we need regime change in Russia and war crimes tribunals, including for Vladimir Putin. Well, that's a whole different range of war, and every one of those has a radically different budget in terms of what it would take to succeed in accomplishing those missions. And that's why they avoid the conversation, because then there would actually be accountability for, well, I don't know, how many resources do we need? So they want to slow drip it, which is what we've done so far this century with the war on terror and other things. Just keep cutting the checks. And you'll have the same results. You won't actually accomplish the mission, and because it's designed not to actually result in success. Senator Warner recently did an interview where he shared how he thinks it's successful is we're grinding down the Russian army. That's not a just war. That's not even a moral war. You're literally grinding down the Ukrainian population for a mission that isn't even designed to result in victory, right? It's just designed to grind down the Russian army. It's not going to give the Ukrainian people their country back. It's not going to give the people their lives back. It's certainly not going to, so how's that make America more secure? No one is answering it, but it will. The defense contractors do like it. I've got someone who reached out to me that said, yeah, our company actually made their main effort no longer focusing on U.S. sales. They're focusing on Eastern European sales for the next 5 years.
Is there any, just playing the devil's advocate for a very short moment, is there any justification of testing new weapon systems there? Because that's what, you read research from Atlantic Council, they're probably going to say, we are trying new weapons there. Is that justified?
I can't see that as a just war, but yes, certainly we try all kinds of things whenever there's a war. The proving grounds are helpful, but the battlefield is the best way to test anything. And when you can test it on someone else's soil, it's better than testing it on your own.
That's right.
It's not really moral, though. I think it's not a just war if you don't have if you don't have a way to achieve something that couldn't be achieved without war. How's it just? I mean, you could have avoided this war up front with better diplomacy. In my view, they worked to create the war, which is inherently unjust. But you could have prevented this war. And diplomatically, I think you could resolve this war. I don't know about in 24 hours, but I do think you could resolve this war diplomatically. So it will be a negotiated peace. It will not be a total victory because the world is not willing to commit the kind of resources that it would take for a total victory over Russia, I think, at least yet. Maybe they'll do something that cements the resolve or be blamed for doing something that cements the resolve, right? And I think that's the challenge. So for it to be a just war, you would have to be able to achieve something with war that you would not be able to be achieved with diplomacy. And I think that's the real under-resourced thing. When you look at the swamp, the State Department has got to be, I don't know, one of the least effective agencies. They've been just as unsuccessful as the war on poverty, right? So with respect to what would it take to get more, I'm encouraged because Speaker McCarthy said he agrees. We just passed a caps bill. We don't have plans to break the caps.
Right.
And so far, that's really encouraging for me and for even people who oppose the bill, because they were, I think, at least heartened to see that the senators who want to spend more, whether they were Republicans or Democrats, had angst because they believe the cuts are real, the caps are real, and they're going to have to find a way to get around them. And in the Budget Control Act of 2011, they did find a way around them. They created something called OCO, or the Overseas Contingency Operations. That's exactly what Lindsey Graham is trying to create, is something that works outside the caps. And then they didn't score it for a Congressional Budget Office scores. They exempted it and pretended they weren't spending the money for it. And that's the thing that they want to recreate. And we can't let that happen. And I think Speaker McCarthy knows that he can't let that happen.
Right. We have time for one single question to the gentleman there. Does anyone have a... Yeah, you can ask your question, actually. Yeah. No, we can hear you.
Okay. I found it interesting when you talked about the NATO new strategic purpose to project power across the globe. And I found that very interesting because recently Tokyo has announced that they want to open up a NATO office in Tokyo, and also at the Vilnius conference, both the South Korean government and it looks like the Japanese government are also in attendance. So what is your opinion on that?
I mean, I'm encouraged that the same group of countries that want to defend Europe also feel some hope for defending Japan and South Korea. I mean, the reality is the Korean Peninsula, to me, is like the best place on the world to see the difference that the United States can make. But for the United States getting involved in the Korean Peninsula in 1950 to 53, the whole peninsula would be overrun and be like North Korea, frankly, but for China's involvement supporting North Korea, we could have made the entire Korean Peninsula, first world country like South Korea, first world businesses, first world healthcare, free and open society to a far greater extent. And so that all came to a truce at the 38th parallel there. And I think that's really where the clash of ideas is. It's really goes back to that time frame. And we hope that we can resolve it with diplomacy. And as I was alluding to, I think the State Department may not be up to the task. And in a worst case scenario, as Senator Paul was mentioning in his talks, there's a pretty big drumbeat towards war. We've got people that want a true declaration of war preemptively to defend Taiwan. I don't think the American people want to go to war with Taiwan, but they certainly don't want the entire NATO alliance to be involved. And right now, if you look at the Ukraine war, that would inherently be more unequal. So if you think Germany feels less inclined to spend money because they've got these Eastern European buffer countries between themselves and Russia, how much less resolve would they have to do something to help Japan or South Korea? And France has essentially already realized where this is going, and they're like, I think we can get along fine with China. They don't have any plans whatsoever to participate in anything confronting China. And, I think more troubling, although the UK has a little bit of a division in their governance structure like we do, one of their former foreign ministers recently said the same. It's not in the UK interest to engage in any kind of confrontation with China. Right now, they all want to do business with China, and they're willing to completely ignore threats to security. There's only really one threat to peace in Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and it's China, right? So does that mean that we have to go to war against China? No, but I don't think it means that we should be gearing up NATO to be some sort of power projection force into the Pacific.
Please join me in applauding Congressman Davidson. Thank you.